Imagine descending into a narrow cave passage with only darkness and stone walls squeezing you in from all sides. One wrong step and you're stuck, unable to move forward or back. This video features real stories of people who found themselves in the most terrifying traps underground. The tragedy known as the Manchester Hole occurred on November 14, 2005. A group of 100 school children went to the Beverley Park Educational Center in North Yorkshire, which is known for its rich nature. All the students were divided into 9 groups. In one of the groups were 3 friends, Amy, Charlie, and Joseph. They and 8 of their classmates were led by their school maths teacher. Some groups went hiking and exploring the river. Others were going fishing and rock climbing. This group was going down into the Notterdale cave system for an underground adventure. One of the most interesting parts of this cave system was the Manchester Hole. On the surface, it looked like a small hole in the ground, but it led to a huge cave inside. The group was led by a local 17-year-old volunteer who had led excursions in these caves many times. One by one, the students descended into the hole, following the guide's instructions. There was a small passage that led into a huge room. All 13 members of the group moved around the room and climbed over rocks. The ground was covered in several inches of water, but they all had rubber boots on, which kept them well protected. The ceiling of this room was 50 feet high and had stalactite formations growing from above an area the size of a football field. After passing through the cave, another tunnel led from this room into the next. They had to climb down rocks along a muddy path that went lower and lower underground. After a few minutes, the tunnel opened into another large room, but it was completely different from the first. This room had a lower ceiling and was narrower, but still enough space for 11 students and 2 adults to fit in. The students were thrilled with what they saw, but that feeling changed when they saw the hole in front of them. It was a tiny tunnel leading out of this room, nothing more than a hole in the ground. It was only a few feet high and quite narrow. To get to the next room, they would have to crawl on all fours through a tunnel for over 40 feet. They were nervous about the dim light and not being able to see past the person in front of them. But the math teacher was behind the last student and encouraged them to follow the guide and move on. Once in the next cave, the guide was worried because the water level was so high. He didn't remember it being that high before. All the students were knee-deep in water. The guide was confused and wondered where the water was coming from. After all, it hadn't rained that day. But he was sure of one thing: they needed to get out of this room before the water rose any higher. He sent the teacher back with the students. This time, he brought up the rear and made sure everyone got back safely into the larger, higher second chamber. One by one, the students moved back down the passage they had just left. At first, the movement was calm, just going back, but soon something terrible happened. A torrent of cold water gushed out. The students in the back panicked and shouted at the front, ordering everyone to move faster. Some were kneeling in a foot of water, while others were chest deep in the bottom of the tunnel's sump. The water continued to rise, and the children were desperate to get out of this trap. The teacher was the first to exit the tunnel and help some of the students to safety in the open second chamber. The speed with which the water rose was shocking. Everyone was crying and screaming in the common airspace at the top of the tunnel. With the guide, only 2 students remained, Amy and Joseph. They were in the last air pocket when the water was up to their shoulders. They had to swim through the flooded sump and get through the stalactites. He said that each of them could hold their breath for at least 2 minutes, if they had to, and that they should not panic. The school children were huddled there, trying to catch their breath and work up the courage to dive underwater, holding their breath, not knowing what they would find on the other side. It was a real panic, and they were running out of time. There was no time to wait. The water was approaching the ceiling and showed no signs of stopping. The 3 of them moved to the edge of the air pocket, and with their last breath of air, they dove again and went through the tight tunnel. The guide went first, as he knew the way, and for the children to follow him underwater. Amy and Joseph were right behind him as he dove into the tight sump. Amy squeezed through the tight space and reached out to feel her way. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm roughly and pulled with great force. The 17-year-old guide pulled her through the last section of the flooded tunnel. She was saved. Joseph was the last of the 3 to swim. He was still missing. The guide wanted to go back to see if he could help pull Joseph from the deadly flood, but he was stopped. as it was an undertaking that would kill him too. It became obvious that Joseph had not been able to get out and had drowned. The teacher and guide led the group back to the surface to alert rescue personnel about the lost student. They were surprised to see blue skies and not a drop of rain on the ground. Where did the water come from? In an incredibly terrifying coincidence, the gusts of wind that day had raised the Scar House Reservoir, causing an incredible flow of water. Thousands of gallons of water were released over the reservoir dam into the river below. In just an hour, the river had risen 4 feet, and this water was pouring straight down through the cave system below. Rescue teams arrived at the cave within 20 minutes of being called. The team was able to make their way into the tunnel that led to the final chamber. There, they found the lifeless body of Joseph Lister. Charges of negligence were brought against the county council that ran the center for failing to check the condition of the reservoir before entering the cave. They were eventually found not guilty of these charges, as the accident was not expected and could not have been foreseen. It was a tragic accident that took the life of a pupil. Neil Moss Incident. On March 22, 1959, Oscar Neil Moss, an Oxford student, went to Peak Cavern, Derbyshire. Moss descended into an unexplored hole 1,000 feet from the cave entrance, where he became trapped and gradually poisoned by carbon dioxide. Moss had been to the caves before, but about 2 weeks earlier, other explorers had found a particularly interesting shaft in a previously unexplored chamber about 1,000 feet deep. When Moss learned of the discovery, he was excited to explore it himself. He did not go alone, but was accompanied by 7 others. On March 22, 1959, they all returned to Peak Cavern. As usual, they were equipped with ropes, lamps, helmets, and other necessary materials for caving. The cave was a labyrinth of narrow, winding passages and spacious halls. In some places, the expedition members had to literally crawl through dirty tunnels, sometimes scraping their skin on sharp stone ledges. But after descending about 1,000 feet from the entrance, they finally reached their goal, a spacious underground chamber. But this was not their main goal. The next was a shaft, the depth of which, according to their estimates, was 40 feet. Neil was very inspired by the thought that if he could go down, he would go down in history by becoming the first person to descend into this shaft. Just in case, his comrades handed him a 75-foot ladder, in case their estimate was wrong. After 12 feet, he encountered his first challenge, a corkscrew turn. Moss managed to squeeze through a narrow horizontal passage about 3 meters long. He slowly moved forward, pushing the ladder in front of him, until he reached a vertical shaft descent about 20 feet deep. No one had gone there before. But then his path was blocked by a massive boulder. He was confident that he could move the stone out of the way, but when he tried to do so, the ladder got stuck underneath it. Unfortunately, he was unable to escape from this trap. Frustrated, he decided to give up and climb back up the shaft. But since the ladder was stuck, it meant he couldn't lift his legs and had to crawl up the ground, which was impossible in these conditions. Realizing the trouble he was in, Moss tried not to panic and twisted as best he could to cope with the space. Unfortunately, before he could make any progress upward, he got stuck in a turn that was only 18 inches wide. Trapped between the rock and the ladder, he couldn't move up or down, and the air entering the shaft was suddenly blocked by his body. He needed to be rescued immediately before his oxygen ran out. So he yelled at his friends to pull the ladder up while he held it. At first, they managed to lift it a few inches. Then the ladder got stuck. Moss panicked and then screamed the words, "I'm stuck." Unfortunately, every time they tried to pull him out, his hand slipped off the rope. So he tied the rope around his body, despite his limited movement. But as they pulled, the rope snapped again and again. To make matters worse, the air was polluted with carbon dioxide, as Moss's body blocked the air supply. His companions knew he was in trouble and they couldn't help, so they quickly ran for help. Even the BBC caught on to the problem and sent out a call for help on the radio. In response, the RAF and the National Coal Board, the police and several caving groups, arrived at Peak Cavern within a few hours. Together, the various groups formed a rescue team, and the first thing they did was send out skinny volunteers to try to get to him. It was the quickest thing they could do. Luckily, one of them managed to get to Moss and tie a rope around his chest. But as they pulled on the rope, Moss found it even harder to breathe. So at 12:30 a.m., several oxygen tanks arrived on the scene, and were quickly delivered to the chamber. This gave a small hope of saving him. One of the volunteers managed to get the tank to Moss and gave him a few life-saving gulps of air. Rescuers said it was a miracle that Moss was still alive at this point. Several other rescue attempts continued until the next morning, but none freed Moss. Things then got even more devastating when it started raining heavily. The cave was soon flooded, and the rescue team had to exit the chambers to safety. After the rain stopped, they all rushed back to try again. By this time, it was late at night. Unfortunately, when they reached the entrance to the shaft, they could no longer hear Moss breathing. When news reached Neil's father of his son's death, he burst into tears. The rescue team then decided to continue trying to retrieve Moss's body, but Eric Moss asked them to stop the mission for fear of putting more people in danger. He asked that the shaft be his son's final resting place. The chamber was later named Moss Chamber, and cavers still explore there today. And on one of the stones, the rescuers scratched out his name. Death of John Edward Jones and closure of the cave. On November 24, 2009, John Jones and 10 of his friends and family members entered the Nutty Putty Cave system. All but John returned. The Nutty Putty Caves, first explored in 1960, were notorious for their narrow, slippery passages, twists and turns. The cave system is accessible through a narrow passage just 30 inches wide. After a series of high-profile rescues between 1999 and 2004, the safety of the cave was widely and publicly questioned. In all of these incidents, people became stuck in the narrow passages of the cave, including a man who was stuck for more than 7 hours, very close to where John would later become stuck. John hasn't been exploring caves in years, but he did it often as a child, and even as a young boy, John was a frequent stranded victim for the Utah Cave Rescue Team, a group his father helped found. For the first hour, all was going well. The group of friends were exploring their largest room in the cave, called the Big Slide. It was at this point that his brother Josh and 2 of their friends challenged each other to go further into the next part of the cave, taking on one of the more difficult areas to navigate, known as the birth canal, which opens up into a new room at the end. John knew that several people had gotten stuck in the birth canal years before, but he figured he could make it anyway. John went first, followed by his brother. Both were crawling on their bellies, and John unknowingly took a wrong turn, one that wasn't marked on the route, and ended up in what explorers called a corkscrew. Only the smallest and most flexible could squeeze through such places. As John moved forward, the passage became narrower and narrower, and he could not turn back. When he saw what looked like a small opening at the end of the hole, he continued walking. Unfortunately, this is where things took a turn for the worse, because John was crawling headfirst into a 10 by 18 inch crack that went straight down. He inhaled to squeeze through it, and it was a fatal mistake, because when his chest expanded again, he found himself completely trapped. John began to call for help from his brother, who was supposed to follow him. Josh made several attempts to free his brother, but none of them worked. In fact, he made the situation worse. John had slid further down the passage and was now completely upside down, with both arms pinned to his side, unable to move at all. Josh then alerted his friends to the problem and the need to call for backup. At 12:30 a.m., the first rescuer arrived on the scene. It was Susie Modela, a local volunteer. Susie tried absolutely everything she could think of to get John out, including cutting off part of his jeans to make some room. But after 2 hours, Susie was exhausted and unable to do it. By this time, there were over 30 people on the surface ready to help. They discussed all possible rescue options, from breaking John's legs to smearing the walls with a few gallons of oil. They had to hurry, as John had been upside down for a long time, and he had about 10 hours before his organs began to fail. The heart relies on gravity, and if it can't, blood and fluids quickly begin to pool in the brain and lungs, eventually making it extremely difficult to breathe. The rescuers decided that the first step was to change John's position to relieve the strain on his lungs. They immediately began installing the first set of pulleys and cables, but soon ran into a number of serious problems. John's legs and feet were in such a position that they could not bend backwards due to the curve of the shaft he had fallen into. In addition, his chest had become stuck on a rocky ledge when he took a deep breath. However, the rescuers managed to lift him up a little to change his position and administer intravenous fluid to improve his circulation. However, just a few seconds later, the first block system failed, and John slid down again, returning to the same predicament he was in initially. John was obviously starting to panic, and to calm him down a little, They brought a radio into the cave so he could talk to his wife, while the rescue team continued to build a new system for lifting blocks to save the stuck man. On the 19th hour of the operation, they succeeded and were ready to lift John. The first jerks during the lifting were the most painful for John. His legs literally crunched and could break at any moment. But on the third jerk, John rose high enough and you could even see his face. His eyes were bloodshot since he had been upside down the whole time. When it seemed that John would be saved, a fatal accident occurred. One of the devices that are part of this system failed. A bolt that was drilled into one of the walls of the cave flew out, as a result of which part of the cave collapsed, and John actually fell back into the area where he had been all this time. The entire team was exhausted. John was barely breathing and no longer responded to the rescuers. The last hope was to drill out the rock around John, but alas, it was useless. Realizing that he had stopped responding, the rescuer measured John's pulse on his leg and pronounced him dead on November 25th at 23:56, 28 hours after he had initially gotten stuck. The next morning, attempts were made to retrieve his body, but it was impossible to do so without deforming the body. And then his wife Emily decided to leave him there and fill the cave with concrete so that such incidents would never happen again. John's family installed a memorial plaque at the entrance to the cave in his memory.